Hello and welcome to Break It Up. I'm Madhavdas G, and joining us today in the midst of all of the activity that's happening in the international front, whether it's the United States formally notifying the 50% tariffs or India's deepening ties with Russia and China. What should India expect? How are you to brace for what's coming up ahead? And how much of this is something that we should only be looking at in terms of the short-term effects, or is this something that is more medium or long-term? To talk about all of that, I have with me Mr. Ashraf, who's a former Indian ambassador to France and somebody who's been watching India's relations and, of course, as an IFS officer, been looking at them very closely. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. Let me begin by asking you, now that US has formally notified the 50% tariffs on Indian products effective from Wednesday, after we've seen how the ties between the two countries have been deteriorating following the collapse of the trade deal negotiations, and a number of statements that have been coming in particularly from top bureaucrats and officials in the United States. How do you view this development as far as the larger trajectory, as far as India and US's relations are concerned?
Well, this is certainly a moment of crisis in the relationship, and I would say also a rupture in communication, a strategic communication between our two countries. The tariffs, as well, is really a manifestation and expression of a deeper problem that has to do with the personalities, uh, persons, egos, projections, appropriation of benefits or credits for cessation of India-Pakistan conflict. So whether it is talking about trade tariffs or secondary sanctions or secondary tariffs on account of Russian oil imports, it's really, if you see it, a manifestation of a rupture in communication based entirely on a particular personality profile and a sense of a person being having boundless power over the rest of the world. So India, along with a few other countries like South Africa, Brazil, China, and Russia, have refused to submit to, say, a president monarch, not capitulate and surrender national interests to satisfy a person's particular interests. And yet, so therefore, these are issues on which we have to recognize that goes beyond rational, logical reasons, and therefore makes negotiations that much more difficult, particularly when there is a continuous volley of rhetoric on a daily basis, some of which with the most corrosive language. So I think that, in a sense, inhibits us or constrains us because there is also a domestic political issues here. Of course, there is an economic consequence, and there are geopolitical implications of all this. Now, the immediate consequence will be certainly for us to weigh. Now, the government can take a number of steps. Of course, there is a question of whether you can depreciate your currency to partially offset this, but there are implications for inflation and importing inflation. There are also concessions, credits, repayment terms, in some ways soften the blow, lower the price for the time being, absorb the losses so that you can keep the market share. Ultimately, the tariff is being paid by the customer there. So how much of that you can absorb on your side, either by fiscal and monetary support that the government can give, and partially also by absorbing some of the losses, or let's say a reduction in margins, in order to maintain competitiveness and market share in the short run, because that's very important. Next step, well, of course, would be that we find some way to re-engage in a more rational, in a calm-headed, meaningful manner to address our mutual concerns while protecting the two very key areas: sovereign choices, which regard to how we deal with other countries, as also our sensitive sectors, because that has been non-negotiable for us with regard to the United States since at least 20 years. I've dealt with the US for about more than a decade, and this was always a perennial issue: agriculture, dairy, etc. But the administrations also recognize that these are extremely sensitive sectors for India. They concern the livelihood of some of the most vulnerable sections of our population, and therefore there was no point in pressing India to open them,
Okay.
particularly when there are distortions there. So we
But I
have to
must
start
ask you, but I
by.
must ask you, Mr. Ashraf, there's a perception, and there are several parliamentarians even who've articulated this view, and there are others also who've spoken about it. You've seen those comments on social media since this controversy began, that India should perhaps hit back with reciprocal tariffs. What is your view on that?
I mean, if you look, the reason President Trump is able to get away, or he's doing what he's doing with us, in the sense using some sort of punishment or retribution for not recognizing who he is because we do not have the requisite economic leverage or the political leverage that China or Russia are able to exercise. And so his negotiations with China began with 145 percent tariff, in prohibitions on certain exports. China responded with equal tariffs, but also by restricting supply of critical minerals, rare earth, magnets, etc. And that brought them to a negotiating position. I do not see what advantage slapping reciprocal duty on the United States would have, given the size of their exports to India. As it is, there is a perception in the U.S. industry that they're not doing well in India, or returns on their investments in India are not as strong as they had anticipated in the past few years. So I don't think that reciprocal tariffs may be helpful domestically in sending a message that we can stand up to a bully, or that we can impose a cost. But we have to see that can only lead to further escalation and higher tariffs. You've just seen that President Trump, who has absolutely no commitment to any negotiations or deals he enters into, just announcing that he might impose tariffs for countries that impose digital taxes. And that would involve a lot of countries. So even those with whom he's had a deal, he is in a sense reopening that. He actually negotiates with himself. He doesn't negotiate with other countries. He decides what he has to do, then he changes his position. So it's a very difficult thing to deal
Well,
with.
well,
But
well,
you
let's only
can't.
hope he changes his position as far as India is concerned very
Yes.
soon. But, there's a larger question over here, because it's not just about Washington. Is there a larger message as far as India is concerned, that even tomorrow, Moscow or Beijing could shape the global rules to India's disadvantage unless Delhi does more to sort of hedge its bets, perhaps more smartly? And how do we go about doing that?
Well, I think the first thing is economic growth. That is a sine qua non. You need to escalate from 6.5% to go up to 8-9%. Sustain this over a period of 20 years. Develop great industrial skills and capacities. The defense self-reliance is very important, because let me tell you this: in an unpredictable world, you do not decide your strategy on the basis of any specific threat or challenge or risk. You decide on the basis of saying that I must have the capability to deal with any kind of uncertainty or any kind of black swan events or shocks that I might see in the future. And which is why you need to have a very strong economy, a very strong industrial base, a very strong defense industrial base. And at the same time, I would say that you live in what you call Indo-Pacific, or the Asia, which or Asia Eurasia region, your vast extended continental and maritime neighborhood. Any country needs to first secure its relationships there. And that brings me to the point that in a world that is in a flux, and where everything is fluid, equations are changing rapidly, alliances are disintegrating. You need, as you said rightly, to be able to have a very diversified portfolio of relationships that enable you to hedge against any kind of risk. And which is why, for example, I think we are doing the right thing in our representation in SCO, our participation at the level of the Prime Minister. Prime Minister is going to Japan. The Singapore Prime Minister is coming next year. There will be a large number of global summits in India. You need to focus on Russia, need to find a way to normalize relations with China, while recognizing that there are very difficult issues to deal with in China, and there is a great trust deficit. So you're not being naive, but you need to ease that relationship. You need to invest much more in relationship with European countries, particularly with some great strategic partners like France and Germany, UK, and then Southeast Asia, Gulf and South Asia and the maritime neighborhood is where your security challenges, your risks begin. And that's where you need to also focus on. And I think the government is fully cognizant of it, and that it is moving with a quite high degree of felicity in addressing these challenges while remaining open to negotiations, firm but restrained and open to continuing the process of dialogue. Look, nobody can
Yeah.
deny the importance of US relations for India.
Absolutely. And in fact, I'm glad you mentioned China and Russia because there's a lot of questions and concern about whether we can actually, given whatever has happened recently with China, trust them completely. Of course, we've seen NSA go to, for instance, Beijing. There's Mr. Wang Yi who's come here to New Delhi, so on and so forth. We've even seen Mr. Jaishankar go recently to Moscow. But when it comes to China, there are a lot of questions about whether we are perhaps being a little overzealous about what we can expect, given China's own territorial ambitions and concerns that India has had. Also, of course, now, while they may have announced a lot of confidence-building measures, for instance, rare earths, etc., how much of that is, really something that will remain in perpetuity, or whether that's just leverage that they can choose to yank off at some point of time from the table?
Good question. I think this kind of hyper attention is in the media. For one, let me say this: that the government has been engaged with China after Galwan in efforts to disengage in the border region, to bring about peace and tranquility, and find a modus vivendi to restore engagement. And that process has actually gathered some momentum since last year, much before this crisis with the United States happened. The second thing is that, look, China is a major power today, which is our neighbor. And this is the first time, I think, in our independent history, we have a neighbor which is a major power with which we have a fairly adversarial relationship since decades, actually. And we have a number of challenges at multiple levels: bilateral, regional, on issues at global levels. So at all these three levels, we have challenges with China. I don't think, and including on trade, water, not just on the boundary question. But the issue is should you have a strategy in which you absolutely do not engage with China because you have those difficulties? In fact, if you don't, your challenges are only going to multiply. So you need to find a way to engage, to ease tensions, normalize relations, and find opportunities for cooperation. And when I say opportunities for cooperation, you have to recognize that our desire for industrial Atmanirbharta and a massive industrialization program also hinges on some way of dealing with China. The reason I'm saying this is that 35% of global manufacturing output is in China, which is almost equal to the next 10 countries, which have 37%. So you can do this without being naive, without being over romantic about that all things can be simply sorted out in a day, or that you're going to be the best friends forever. Those things are different. Government, it will be very conscious of the challenges in the relationship and the need that there is a trust deficit which we have to bridge, but at the same time not engaging a neighbor which is with which we have difficulties, is not a strategy that would lead us to a better future.
Right.
Or to rely on a third country to solve our problems with China would mean that we are simply transposing our vulnerability against one country to a vulnerability against another country. So
Right.
I think this is something which are very, and I can tell you this, that Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi, since he's come to office, has never lost sight of the fact that India's prosperity, India's future cannot be pursued to its full potential in a very hostile and a difficult neighborhood.
Right. In fact, one of your pieces, you've actually argued, Mr. Ashraf, that global shifts are being accelerated by President Trump towards multipolarity. Do you see, therefore, these tariffs as part of Trump's efforts to force nations like India to choose sides in this new order? Is that a deliberate part of the strategy, do you feel?
Yeah, so I'll tell you this. I mean, first of all, his tariff, as I said right in the beginning, has two, as far as general proposition is concerned, he has this deeply held view, which is a MAGA view, that the United States has lost out because the world has ripped off the United States. And the solution is tariffs. I don't think that's going to necessarily solve all of the United States problems. So that's a structural issue he's obsessed with, and it's a deep belief of them. But with regard to India, I think it is, as I said, a lot of emotional response of rage and anger over certain things that have happened, as I've just explained. But what the tariff is thing is doing is accelerating a trend which has been visible for some time, even in the United States. The United States has been turning away since 2008 global financial crisis, away from the multilateral rules-based trading system which it was the architect of, because it no longer finds that useful or interesting. It believes it was a fetters that has in a sense emasculated the United States, and that US power is best exercised in a bilateral context rather than in a multilateral framework. And therefore you've seen this retreat, hesitancy and then retreat, including during the Biden era. But what we are also witnessing, therefore, since the beginning of 2000, but accelerated after 2008, is a shift from multilateralism to regionalism and bilateralism in international trade. So this is a big change, and it is going to gather further momentum. That's one part of it. The second is that President Trump is stripping US engagement globally, but also particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, of all the instruments that you have seen. You know, trade, technology, investments, mobility of people, security commitments and guarantees, soft power, education. So these were the instruments of US hard power and soft power abroad. And there is not even any guarantee that the US military will be used to support the allies in particular way. You've seen that with Taiwan and others. So AUKUS is itself under review. So, what that would mean is that as this happens, more and more countries in the world would start hedging and balancing, which means they will seek other relationships. One, they will try to enter into other FTAs under pressure from their exporters, or join existing FTAs, as UK did with CPTPP. And they will also try to cooperate among themselves. I see that they will also be trying to accommodate China in the Indo-Pacific region. So people will try to ease their relationship, and all of this on the trade side, on the geopolitical side, and on the security side will eventually lead to I believe, a diminution of US power in this part of the world, and therefore a much higher level of multipolarity. It's not going to be a either or binary situation between China and the United States. There's going to be a simultaneous rise of many other countries, including India, that will shape the course of multipolarity. I mean, it's a rising tide. That is goes beyond. And I tell you, you can see the number of countries that are interested in joining BRICS or in SCO, organizations that are relatively new in this world and that are really in this part of the world. And as President Macron said 2 years ago, just before the South Africa summit, when BRICS was expanded, he said that in a public speech that to his heads of government mission. And this is very interesting. He said that, we need to reflect in Western countries why so many countries are queuing up to join BRICS. No one is knocking on the doors of our institutions. So this is what I'm saying, a trend that is going to happen. And that is really a period when your diplomacy has to be nimble, has to be flexible, has to be very clear-eyed about our interests. And that will work when, as I said, you focus on developing your
Yeah.
capabilities, which Prime Minister has announced a very comprehensive agenda for.
Absolutely. My last question to you, should we be doubling down on the Quad or attempting to boost BRICS in this situation?
No, I don't think it is either or situation. I mean, see, Quad itself, we has a certain purpose. It also depends on how the United States looks at Quad in the future. You see, remember there is a structural issue there. Three of the members of Quad are Pacific oriented formal military allies. India is not one of them. We are Indian Ocean oriented. We have more focus on non-security, except in maritime domain awareness, HADR, counterterrorism, cybersecurity, etc. So there is already, and if President Trump is not going to engage in this region on the non-security dimensions such as aid, trade, education, mobility, sustainability, etc., then that narrows the agenda of Quad. Then there are problems in the relationship at the moment between U.S. and Japan and U.S. and Australia. I mean, if this AUKUS is reviewed and new terms are imposed on an already unequal deal for Australia, then it undermines confidence in Quad. So I think we'll have to see how this plays. So, but we can't look at as two alternatives. India has never played that game. We've not allowed BRICS or SCO to become anti-Western platforms, nor do we turn Quad into something that is a binary choice between the two. But we'll
All
have
right.
to see how that goes ahead with Quad.
All right. Ambassador Javed Ashraf, thank you so much for taking the time out and breaking it down for our viewers.
Thank you very much.